Hello people of the internet, this is Kaijin Noir here with my review for Rogue One, a Star Wars story, the first spin-off film in the franchise, as well as Disney's follow-up to last year's Star Wars, The Force Awakens. Now before I get into the actual review, I do want to make a quick shout out to all of my fans who have helped me reach 1,000 subscribers recently. I can't thank you enough how happy I am to have reached this far, and I do want to plan a future video somewhere down the line to help commemorate this occasion. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to approach a 1,000 subscriber special, but I do have some ideas in mind. Hopefully they pan out well. But just to start things off, I do want to say thank you so very much everybody who has supported me ever since I started this channel way back in 2012. And so hope you enjoy the videos to come. Also, I want to warn you guys right off the bat that I am going to include some minor spoilers in this review because thankfully, the marketing for this film has not revealed a lot of details, very similar to The Force Awakens, where you would have a basic premise of what the film is about, but doesn't really go into any of the character details, or like the backstories, or any of the nitty-gritty plot details. So, I feel like in order for me to properly convey my thoughts about this film, I'm probably going to have to go into some detail. So yeah, minor spoilers alert. Plus, I don't think it's really that much of an issue since I'm pretty sure most of you have already seen this film by now and are just watching this video just to know what I personally thought of it. So let's get started. So Rogue One, a Star Wars story, takes place between episodes 4 and 3. It starts off with Jyn Erso, our main protagonist, as a little child whose father was a head scientist who was the major researcher behind the construction of the Death Star, and he was later pretty much like taken by force by the Empire to work for them, and as a result, Jyn Erso had to survive for 15 years without a proper family, a proper home. She lived a troubled past, and now 15 years later, since she was separated from her parents, she is recruited by the Rebel Alliance, who wish to use her connection to her father in an attempt to gain some form of information about this super weapon, which, of course, as we Star Wars fans know, is the Death Star. Along the way, she comes across several individuals, and so eventually they come together to form a mission to retrieve any sort of valuable information of the Death Star that will eventually lead into the events of Episode 4, A New Hope. One of the biggest differences I noticed between this film and The Force Awakens was that while The Force Awakens attempted to recapture a lot of the escapist fantasy aspects of the original trilogy, this film tried to do away with the charming, witty, fun adventure feel of the original Star Wars movies and try to go for a more gritty war film. So it's like, in terms of Star Wars, it's less about the star, it's more about the war. And this is really going to be this sort of like a artistic choice I feel like it's not going to flow with several people, but for me, I really enjoyed the change of pace, and I really like that more down-to-earth, more depressing, survivalist type of like desperation, that set the tone for this entire film. A lot of the characters are very broken down after years of rebelling. In fact, one thing I found really fascinating was that it's not really super black and white like in the original movies where the good guys are super good, the bad guys are super bad. Within the Rebel Alliance, there's actually a lot of conflict within this organization, so much so that one of the characters, Saw Gerrera, played by Forrest Whitaker, actually became a rebel extremist and departed from the Rebel Alliance and started his own faction, and they perform a lot of more morally reprehensible type of actions. And even within the Rebel Alliance itself, we see several characters, such as Diego Luna's character, which I believe is Cassian Andor. He is also very morally questionable. He does make morally questionable actions, as he's willing to do whatever it takes to survive, even if it means having to stab his allies in the back, or having to make a desperate call. There was even a line where Cassian Andor mentioned that he's been doing a lot of this rebel work since he was 6 years old, and so a lot of that has kind of like deteriorated any sort of like sympathy or humanity within him. And I guess that's one of the biggest themes of Rogue One, where it's a lot of these characters who have been beaten and broken after so many years of fighting the Empire that they've kind of lost all hope. And in fact, it's through Jin's interactions with her father, and she is able to rediscover that hope, a new hope, if you will, and tries to inspire the characters around her. And it also leads into like the look and feel of the movie. There are some sequences where there are like random skirmishes within the this one planet. I believe it was Jeddah, and I think it was sort of like the original home of the Jedis, or like where the Jedis came from. I'm not sure if that's the case, but I could remember, if I could remember, like at some point in the movie, the Empire is attempting to mine this Jeddah planet for these crystals in order to power the Death Star, and it's these crystals that I believe were used to create the lightsabers for the Jedi. Of course, I could be completely wrong here, but there are brutal battles that take place in Jeddah, and they really feel like something that you would see out of like an Iraqi war, where there are like people dying left and right, like a battle or a skirmish can take place at any time. The film features a lot of on-the-ground action, and you can really feel the weight of the battles. After checking out several reviews of this film online, I've noticed that one complaint that seems to be very prevalent among critics is that in terms of the characters, we don't get a lot of information about their backstories. We don't really get to know these characters as they come together to form this small band of ragtag group of rebels. And I do agree that we don't get to the chance to know a lot of them. We kind of see them, we see their interactions with each other, but we don't get to know where they came from. Even Jyn Erso, we're told of her backstory, but we really don't know like what exactly happened to her in the 15 years since. It's kind of like that old rule of filmmaking or storytelling where it's like show, don't tell. Show us what she's been through so that we can understand why she is the way that she is, rather than being told of what she's been through. This can also be the case with Cassian Andor. As I mentioned before, we're told that he's been doing a lot of this work since he was 6 years old, and which is how he got to this point. I wish we could have seen how he got to that point, but I suppose maybe Disney wants us to eventually buy the tie-in Marvel comic if we want to see where these characters came from. But if there's one thing I can say about that is that I do wish that we could see more of where these characters came from, especially Donnie Yen. I'm not sure the name of his character, but he plays this blind ex-guardian of the Jeddah Crystal Temple, and after losing his position, he kind of just lives on the streets with his partner, who is this big bodyguard dude, who is pretty quiet for most of the film. I really wish we could have found out where those guys came from, and how those guys with very different personalities came to meet one another. But despite not getting the chance to learn a lot about these characters, I really do like their personalities. I do like their interactions with one another. And I feel like their personalities are still able to shine through their actions rather than their dialogue. It's kind of a similar thing to what I saw in Shin Gojira, where you have a lot of human characters, these politicians, and we have like next to no information, almost zero backstory about any of these characters. However, it's sort of like an in-the-moment type of plot that allows us to try to determine what type of characters they are through their actions, given that they're constantly on the move, constantly planning, constantly coming up with ideas as to what they're going to do next. So the story doesn't give them time to really, show us who they are. We at least get to see that sort of thing play through, especially during the last act of the film, when you have this last battle on a certain planet where the team, Rogue One, is going in to acquire the information on the Death Star. And so it's this big battle, and eventually they inspire more of the Rebel Alliance to join them. And so the battle keeps growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually it all culminates in this final act that really leaves a huge impact on you by the end. As for the characters, I didn't really think that Jyn Erso came off as a very likable character. However, she still came off as relatable, in the way that we can understand where she came from, and we're given enough information to understand why she is the way that she is. That being said, I didn't really enjoy watching her character, at least in the first act of the film, due to the fact that she always came off as a very cold character, someone who was always incredibly pessimistic towards anyone, and she had really no soft side to her, at least with a character like Rey from The Force Awakens. Yes, she was very cold, had a very cold exterior towards a lot of people, but we saw some downtime with her at the very beginning of the movie. We saw her daily life and saw that she had this very interesting aspect to her that we could latch onto. With Jyn Erso, because we're always seeing her like in the moment, always fighting, always running, always being being followed by someone. We don't get that chance to see her in any sort of like downtime. So I really wish we could have done that. But by the time she learns the fact that her father is still alive, we do see some of that innocence in her. We see some more of that, like that softer side to her. And it was at that point where I was able to get more into following this character along the way. One thing I also found similar was that this film is, of course, directed by Gareth Edwards, whose last film was Godzilla 2014, the second attempt at an American adaptation of the Godzilla character. And one of my biggest issues with Godzilla 2014 was the main protagonist, Ford Brody, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson. My biggest issue with Ford Brody is that he was, in a way, kind of similar to Jyn Erso, where he's a character who we don't really get to, we're told in a way of his backstory. We saw a little bit of his backstory at the beginning of Godzilla 2014, but we had this huge time skip, very similar to what we see in Rogue One with Jyn Erso, and so we immediately see him as an adult, and he also has a very stoic, cold exterior. He doesn't really show a lot of emotion, and due to his upbringing as a bomb disposal soldier. And because we're always seeing him on the move, we're always seeing him trying to get to his family, moving from point A to point B to point C, we have like very little downtime and no chance really to see him act as a human being, as opposed to just being a character who's supposed to go from point A to point B, in a way similar to Jyn Erso. However, with Jyn Erso, like I said, it's through her father that we see like the humanity in her, whereas with Ford Brody, we saw like his character come out in his interactions with his father, played by Bryan Cranston. However, because Bryan Cranston's character was killed off early in the film, Ford Brody has like no real character. Not only that, but Ford Brody, along his journey, he really is all alone and has no one to interact with. With Jyn Erso, thankfully, she has several characters to bounce off of, especially the droid K2SO and Cassian Andor. So in a way, it's like Jyn Erso could have easily become as problematic as Ford Brody, as a very flat character like Ford Brody, not in terms of backstory, but in terms of like execution. And luckily, Jyn Erso did have enough motivation and enough interaction with enough characters to come off as appealing for the most part. On the opposite end, we have the droid that I just mentioned, K2SO, an Imperial droid that was reprogrammed to fight for the side of the rebellion, and he is by far my favorite character. He's always got a witty one-liner. He felt like the most like classic Star Wars. His his funny dialogue helped take a break from a lot of the depressing action. I was always laughing every time he spoke on screen, which was another thing that if you've seen my review for Civil War, you may have known that because I'm in Japan and I watch these movies in a Japanese theater, Japanese audiences, they never laugh at anything that they see on screen, at least in my experiences. So while my friends and we were laughing at every line that K2SO was saying, there was always a part of me that felt a little nervous, as usual, like with Civil War and Deadpool, whenever a joke is supposed to make the audience laugh, and my friends and I are the only people that are laughing in the theater. And the theater itself was pretty packed. I want to say it was just as packed as when we saw Civil War, which is surprising because, once again, we saw it at a late night screening at 9 o'clock. Yeah, 9 o'clock is the latest time they only show movies in. And even then, it was still almost like relatively packed. Now, as for the film's villain, Krenek, He is the director of the advanced weapons research for the Empire, and he's the individual who took Jyn Erso's father away from her because he needed him to work on the Death Star. And so Krenek, he was the man who oversaw the construction of the Death Star. And it's during the events of this film that after a certain individual working under Krenek defected from the Empire, the Empire decided to take action against Krenek and decided to send in another individual to take control away from Krenek. And so throughout this film, Krenek tries to prove himself towards the Empire. Is because he feels like he was responsible for the Death Star, and so he wants to be in control of this project that he's been working the last 15 years on. And I really like the personal connection between him and Jyn. Unfortunately, like Jyn and Krenek, they don't have a lot of screen time together. They barely have any interactions with each other. But I do like Jin's father acts as that personal connection between the two of them. And I do like that we get to see some conflict within the Empire between Krenek and his superiors. Very similar to how we see a lot of conflict within the Rebel Alliance themselves. So it's like there's a lot of conflict on both sides that eventually culminates in them kind of each side settling their shit and eventually coming to the status quo that we see in Episode 4, A New Hope. Next was another character I mentioned before, which was Donnie Yen. I really liked his character because he was kind of like the spiritual guide for the team. He has a lot of faith in the Force. I really like that he is a character who most likely is in tune with the Force, even though he is not a Jedi. And I like the ambiguity as to whether or not he can actually use the Force, because he's not someone who is trained in the arts of a Jedi. And I always like that. Even in The Force Awakens, we had another character who was also sort of a Yoda-esque spiritual guide, and that she could tap into the Force despite not being a Jedi herself. And so I really like that. It helped expand the universe, showing that the Force is not just exclusive to Siths and Jedis. And it also helps bring back an aspect of the Force that we haven't seen since the original trilogy, in that the Force itself is, again, treated more as a religion, as more of a spiritual plot device, as opposed to being something that can be explained away through bacteria in your blood called midichlorians, which was what was established in the prequels. Here, like, the Force is treated, like I said, it's treated more like a religion. It's kind of really based on faith. And it's sort of like these characters, and it kind of ties into the themes of the film about these characters kind of renewing their faith, not in the Force per se, but more in like finding faith in each other, faith in the cause, faith in the Alliance. The other character that I also mentioned was Saw Gerrera, played by Forrest Whitaker, and I do like that he represents the extremist side of the rebellion, and it helped expand the world of Star Wars, showing that there's more to the Rebel Alliance than the squeaky clean good guys versus bad guys setup here. I feel like we could have gotten a bit more out of him in terms of screen time. Almost, again, kind of similar to what we saw with Bryan Cranston, where Saw Gerrera, he's removed from the film quite early on, and I feel like we could have seen more of him. At least I wish we could have seen more of his interactions with Jyn Erso instead of once again being told of his connection to Jyn Erso, despite the fact that they shared a lot of experiences together, with Saw Gerrera supposedly being the surrogate father to Jyn Erso in the time between when she was separated from her parents and now. With Diego Luna as Cassian Andor, he's probably the least interesting character despite having potential to be the most interesting character. He fulfills his role adequately, but just like with a lot of these characters, I really wish that we did learn more about him. However, despite my complaints about not getting to know a lot of these characters, I still really enjoy them. I enjoyed the dialogue between them. I do enjoy a lot of these characters. Of course, K2SO and perhaps Donnie Yen's character are my favorite out of the bunch. But I really feel like a lot of these characters and their actors portraying them really shine the most in that third act. I think that third act really saved this film and kind of brought out the best qualities of this film. Before getting to my final thoughts, I feel like I can't talk about Rogue One without bringing up Darth Vader. And yeah, Darth Vader, he's not a very essential... He is essential to the plot, but his role in the film is very downplayed, and I really did enjoy that. I'm glad that when he's there, it's very impactful. The movie itself didn't, at least the trailers alone, did not try to play up the fact that he's going to be in that movie for very long. It's not like a Godzilla 2014 situation where the movie advertises Godzilla and you're going to the film expecting to see Godzilla, and the film doesn't really have a lot of Godzilla, at least in terms of screen time and especially the story itself. The story did not revolve around Godzilla, rather it was all focused on the Mutos. Here with Rogue One, they didn't play up Darth Vader a lot, although maybe the advertising probably went a little too far with showing, oh, guess what everybody, Vader is back, this is the Vader you've been waiting for. And yeah, he is amazing, he is awesome in the film, but like I said, he's downplayed, and I feel like that worked to the film's advantage, so it's like when he's there, he is there. The film is not like very reliant on him. Luckily, the film is able to stand on its own without having to rely too much on older characters. That being, I guess, I don't know, because I guess the film is sort of like a double-edged sword when it came to its use of nostalgic characters, because there are several characters that do make cameos here and there, like I mentioned Darth Vader, and several others along the way. In some cases, there are characters who actors are not around or are not in their prime anymore, and so the film tries to come up with a way to digitally insert them in the film. I won't go any further than that, but I feel like it was a very admirable attempt in trying to tie in this film more with the lore of Star Wars, but I feel like it wasn't 100% successful, and I feel like maybe it was too ambitious to try to tie in more to the lore of the classic trilogy. That being said, luckily for Darth Vader, he is a man in the suit, so it's much easier to portray him. And of course, they had James Earl Jones back to do the voice of Darth Vader. He didn't sound exactly the same. I feel like his age is kind of catching up to him, and he didn't sound it quite right. Maybe it was the actor's performance because, he's getting up there in age, or maybe it's they did something with the digital augmentation of his voice. Maybe they didn't like deeper booming voice that they did in the previous movies. I'm not sure if it was like a digital thing or it was the actor's thing, but maybe more than likely it was the actor's performance. But in terms of physical presence, Darth Vader certainly shines through. So for my overall thoughts on Rogue One, A Star Wars Story, in a way, I think it's probably better than The Force Awakens, because with The Force Awakens, it did have a lot of what we come to expect out of Star Wars, a lot of the same escapist, fantasy, adventure, the funny, charming, witty characters and dialogue. But in a way, I feel like it was too close, like as many people complain, it was too close to the original trilogy to where it was pretty much copying beat for beat the story to Episode 4, A New Hope. Whereas with this one, it went for a more bolder, more original direction. And so because The Force Awakens tried to go so far as to copy beat for beat A New Hope, it was very distracting for me. But so while I did like the characters more so in The Force Awakens, I like the story in Rogue One, and I feel like Rogue One overall is probably a better made movie, only because it tried to go in a more original direction, and it didn't really need to rely so much on fan service. There is a lot of fan service here, like I mentioned, there's a lot of cameos, there's a lot of music cues taken from the original. This movie is a Star Wars film, so you're going to see a lot of the same designs, mechs, suits, costumes, settings that you saw in the previous movies. But even then, at least it's not as reliant on nostalgia as The Force Awakens. With The Force Awakens, it felt like a very safe movie where it's like, okay, we want to make a movie that's very familiar to Star Wars fans because we want to get them something that's as close to Star Wars as possible especially after the prequels. Here it's like, okay, you've had something that's as close to Star Wars as you can possibly get without essentially re-airing the original movies, so let's go in a more bolder direction, and I really did like that. I'm going to give Rogue One a 4 out of 5. I feel like it's a really great movie, and I think it's a movie that I will enjoy more so on repeated viewings. And I think in terms of Gareth Edwards films, I've only seen 3 up to this point. I've seen Monsters, Godzilla 2014, and of course Rogue One. And I feel like this is definitely the best out of the 3 movies that I've seen of his. So props to you, Gareth Edwards, and I hope that you go on to do bigger and better things. It's unfortunate that he's not coming back to do Godzilla 2, or as it's now called, Godzilla King of Monsters for 2019, I believe that's when Godzilla King of Monsters is going to come out. But whatever he does in the future, I wish him the best of luck. So those have been my overall thoughts for Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. Hope you've enjoyed my review for this film, and until next time everybody, take care.